The Dakota Territory, autumn of 1883. The air in Providence Creek carried the sharp, metallic scent of impending frost, a promise that was also a threat. For Alara Jensen, a widow of 3 months with a son of 6 years, the scent was a death warrant delivered on the wind. Her husband, Eric, a man who understood the complex geometries of ship hulls better than the simple cruelties of prairie fever, had left her with a plot of land the townsfolk called the Slip. It was a narrow, steep parcel that slid unceremoniously into the fast-moving waters of the Serpent River, deemed unfit for farming, ranching, or even a respectable cabin. He had bought it for the view, for the way the morning sun caught the far bluffs. He was a poet disguised as a carpenter, and now he was gone, leaving Alara and their son, Lars, with nothing but a beautiful, useless vista and the pity of a town that had already written them off as a winter tragedy waiting to happen. They lived in a canvas tent, a relic of Eric's brief and optimistic prospecting phase. It flapped and shuddered in the ceaseless wind, a flimsy barrier against a world that was steadily growing colder. The town council, led by the pragmatic and humorless Silas Blackwood, had offered her a choice: accept a pittance for the land and take the eastbound stage to whatever family she had left, or become a ward of the community, a charity case to be housed in a spare room and fed on scraps of goodwill. Both options felt like a burial. Eric was buried here, under a small stone cross hewn by his own hands. She would not leave him, and she would not be a burden. This land, this useless slip of earth, was all she had of him. It would have to be enough. Alara was a quiet woman, an observer. She had spent her life watching. In Denmark, she watched her grandmother coax herbs from frozen soil. On the ship to America, she watched the ocean, learning its moods, its deceptive calms, and its honest furies. And alongside Eric, she had watched his hands, listened to his quiet dissertations on the way a ship's hull must be both strong and yielding, how it must use the pressure of the water against itself to gain integrity. A ship is a sealed room that must breathe, he used to say, tapping his pipe against the plans for a new keel. It must hold the warmth of life inside while shedding the deadly cold outside. Now, she watched the land. She walked the length of the slip every day, little Lars trailing behind her, his small hand clutching hers. She did not see a dangerous slope. She saw layers. She saw the rich topsoil, then a thick, stubborn band of gray clay, and beneath that, the compressed gravel and rock that formed the river's ancient bed. She watched the animals. The muskrats had already dug their winter lodges into the lower banks, their entrances cunningly placed below the anticipated freeze line. A family of foxes had a den high on the bluff, a dark slash in the earth that was sheltered from the north wind by a stony overhang. They were not building on the land. They were living inside of it. They were borrowing its strength, its permanence. The idea came to her not as a flash of lightning, but as a slow, dawning warmth, like the rising sun on a cold morning. She would not build a cabin on the slip, a wooden box to be battered by the wind and leached of its heat. She would build as the fox builds. She would dig. She would hollow out a home from the high, stable part of the riverbank, the thickest part of that clay seam she had observed. It would be a jordhula, an earth cave, a home of the land itself. She remembered Eric's words about insulation, about the way the sea, a terrible cold, could be held at bay by a few inches of well-designed oak and tar. What was the earth, she reasoned, but a thicker, more patient hull? She began the next morning. Her tools were a spade Eric had used for a small garden, a pickaxe, and a wheelbarrow with a wobbly wheel. The work was brutal, a relentless assault on the compacted earth. She started at the face of the bank, about 20 feet above the autumn water level, a place she had marked with a stake after watching the high water marks left by spring floods on the surrounding trees. She was not just digging a hole, she was carving a space, a deliberate void in the solid world. The topsoil came away easily, but then her spade hit the clay, and the real labor began. It was dense, plastic, and heavy. Each spadeful was a victory wrestled from the earth's grip. Lars, too young to dig, was tasked with hauling the smaller stones away in a bucket, his small face set with a seriousness that mirrored his mother's. The town of Providence Creek noticed. At first, it was a curiosity. Wagons slowed on the river road opposite her land. Men would rein in their horses, watch for a moment, and shake their heads with a chuckle. "What's the widow Jensen up to now?" they'd ask each other at the general store. The answer was always the same. "Digging her own grave, looks like." The project became known as Alara's Folly. It was a source of dark amusement, a cautionary tale in the making. They saw a grieving woman, her mind clearly snapped by loss, digging a mud hole that would surely collapse in the first heavy rain, or, worse, become a frozen tomb when the ground solidified in December. Silas Blackwood did not find it amusing. He was a man of right angles and proven methods. He built the strongest log cabins in the territory, with dovetailed joints so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. His structures were monuments to the triumph of human reason over the chaos of nature. He saw Alara's burrowing as an affront, an act of regression, of madness. He felt a civic duty to intervene. He rode out to her land one afternoon, dismounting from his horse with the heavy finality of a judge approaching the gallows. He stood, hands on his hips, a stout figure of conventional wisdom, and watched her. Alara, her face streaked with sweat and clay, her dress hemmed with mud, continued to work, her movements rhythmic and determined. She would drive the pick into the clay wall to break it up, then scoop the loosened chunks into the wheelbarrow. "Mistress Jensen," Silas began, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. "This has to stop." Alara paused, resting on her spade. She did not look at him with fear or shame, but with a simple, weary appraisal. "Mr. Blackwood, this is unnatural," he said, gesturing at the growing cavity in the earth. It was now about 5 feet deep and perhaps 8 feet wide. "You are digging a trap. The first freeze will heave the ground, and this whole bank will come down on you. If that doesn't kill you, the spring thaw will. The serpent floods. This hole will fill with icy water before you can even scream." "I am building above the flood line," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Her English was precise, with the slight musical lilt of her native Danish. Silas scoffed, a short, sharp bark of derision. "There is no above the flood line on this river. And what of the cold? You think a mud wall will keep you warm? You'll need a fire burning day and night, and this whole place will fill with smoke. You'll suffocate. It's a coffin, woman. A coffin you're digging for yourself and that poor boy." Alara looked from Silas to the dark opening of her nascent home, then to the wide, uncaring sky. She thought of Eric's ships, of the immense, crushing pressure of the deep ocean held back by knowledge and design. "A wall of earth is warmer than a wall of air, Mr. Blackwood," she said, "and a sink can also be a source." He stared at her, uncomprehending. Her cryptic statement only confirmed his diagnosis of her insanity. "I am the builder in this town," he declared, his voice rising. "I know what a home is. This is not a home. I am warning you, for the sake of your son, abandon this folly. Take the council's offer. There is no shame in accepting help when you are beaten." "I am not beaten," Alara replied. She turned back to her work, driving the pickaxe into the clay with a resonant thud. The sound was an answer. It was a full stop at the end of their conversation. Silas Blackwood stood for another minute, his face a mask of frustration and righteous anger. He had done his duty. He had warned the fool. He mounted his horse and rode away, composing the speech he would give to the town council. The widow Jensen was a liability. her stubbornness a danger to her child. They would have to be prepared to intervene when the inevitable disaster struck. He was not wrong. He was an expert. The narrative of Alara's folly solidified in the town's consciousness. She was no longer just a tragic figure. She was a stubborn one, a woman who had refused sound advice from the most qualified man in Providence Creek. The pity she had once received curdled into a kind of grim anticipation. They were watching, waiting for the failure that would prove them right. What they could not see was the intricate design taking shape in Alara's mind. A design born of observation, memory, and a deep respect for the forces Silas Blackwood sought only to conquer. The townspeople saw a hole in the ground. Alara saw a thermal battery. The principle was one of the first things Eric had explained to her about the sea. Water, he'd said, has a tremendous capacity to hold temperature. A ship's cargo hold, deep in the vessel, remained cool for days even after docking in a hot climate, protected by the thermal mass of the ocean itself. The Earth, she knew, was the same, only more so. The ground beneath the frost line maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round, a constant in the high 40s or low 50s Fahrenheit. A log cabin in the Dakota winter had to fight a 100-degree temperature differential, from 70 degrees inside to 30 below zero outside. Her home would only have to bridge a 20-degree gap. The Earth itself would do most of the work. Its immense, passive heat sink, or source, as she'd told Silas, keeping the worst of the cold at bay. Her excavation was not random. She carved a space roughly 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep into the bank. The ceiling she arched slightly, a shape she knew from old Danish longhouses and Eric's ship designs, for superior strength against the vertical load of the earth above. The walls were not left as raw clay. She used the spade to smooth and compact them until they had a hard, almost polished surface. As she dug, she was strategic, setting aside the best, most stone-free clay. She mixed this with dried prairie grass, and, using a wooden form Eric had made for bricks, she began creating dense, sun-dried blocks. These would not be for the walls, but for the floor, laid over a bed of gravel for drainage, and for the interior face of the front wall, the only part of her home truly exposed to the outside air. The front of the dwelling was her greatest challenge. It needed to be an insulator, not a conductor of cold. She framed an opening with scavenged cottonwood logs, thick and sturdy, which she laboriously dragged up from the river's edge. She had no glass for a window, so she planned for only one, a small square she could cover with a greased animal hide stretched on a frame. The door was her masterpiece of thrift. She dismantled the small, flat-bottomed boat Eric had built for fishing on the river, using its stout oak planks. She layered them, stuffing the space between with wool from a ruined blanket, creating a door that was nearly 4 inches thick. But the true genius of her design, the element that lifted it from a simple dugout to a sophisticated dwelling, was its respiratory system. Silas had been right about one thing. A fire in an unventilated hole was a death sentence. Alara had no intention of dying. She remembered Eric puzzling over ventilation shafts on a cargo ship meant for the tropics, explaining how to create a natural, passive airflow using the principle that hot air rises. She spent a week on her chimney. She did not simply punch a hole in the roof. Instead, she built a small, efficient hearth of stone and clay in a rear corner of the room. From the back of this hearth, she channeled the smoke into a flue made of her clay grass bricks. This flue did not go straight up. It ran horizontally, just beneath the ceiling, along the entire length of the back wall, before turning upwards to exit the ground well behind the main living space. This was not just a chimney. It was a heat exchanger. The hot smoke, instead of escaping immediately, was forced to travel 16 feet through the clay flue, its intense heat radiating out and being absorbed by the massive thermal battery of the surrounding earth. She was, as she thought of it, making the smoke pay rent. It was not allowed to leave until it had given up most of its warmth to the home. To complete the system, she dug a much smaller, narrow channel from the outside, running it under the floor to open directly in front of the hearth. This was the cold air intake. It would provide a steady, direct supply of oxygen to the fire, preventing it from drawing the warm air out of the room and creating a continuous, gentle circulation. The house would breathe. By the time the first snows came in late October, Alara's folly was complete. From the river, all that was visible was a thick wooden door and a small, covered window frame set into the face of the high bank, looking for all the world like the entrance to a mine. A thin plume of smoke curled from a small clay chimney pot set 20 feet back from the cliff edge, almost hidden in the dormant prairie grass. Inside, the space was small but not cramped. A bed for her and Lars built into the wall, a small table, 2 chairs, shelves carved directly into the clay walls held their meager supplies. A small cast iron stove, her one significant purchase, was nestled in its hearth. The air was cool but still, free of the drafts that plagued every other structure in Providence Creek. It smelled of earth, wood smoke, and a faint, clean scent of clay. It smelled like safety. Winter arrived, not as a guest, but as an invading army. The temperature plummeted. The wind howled out of the north, a physical force that stripped heat from everything it touched. The Serpent River froze solid, its swift current stilled into a sheet of gray, pockmarked ice. In Providence Creek, life became a battle for warmth. The log cabins, Silas Blackwood's included, shrank into themselves. Despite their tight joinery, the cold found its way in. Frost grew in feathery patterns on the inside of the walls. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding them a constant diet of cordwood. The demand for fuel was voracious, and the wood piles, which had seemed so large in autumn, dwindled at an alarming rate. The world became a small circle of firelight in a vast, encroaching darkness. In Alara's bank home, winter was a distant rumor. The first true blizzard, which buried the town in 3 feet of snow and sent the temperature to 20 below, was, for Alara and Lars, a curiosity. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, it was utterly silent. The tons of earth surrounding them were a perfect sound barrier. The only noise was the gentle crackle of the handful of sticks burning in the stove. The temperature in their small room held steady at a comfortable 65 degrees. The clay walls, saturated with warmth from the smoke flue and the stove, radiated a gentle, persistent heat, like a sleeping animal. She needed only a fraction of the wood her neighbors were burning. A single wheelbarrow load, gathered from the driftwood along the frozen river, could last her 3 or 4 days. She and Lars were not just surviving, they were comfortable. They read books by the light of a tallow lamp. She taught him his letters, tracing them in a tray of sand. They were warm, safe, and utterly isolated from the town that pitied them. Word of their survival trickled back to town, carried by a lone trapper who had passed by and seen the impossible, a gentle curl of smoke rising from the buried home in the midst of the gale. It was dismissed as a fluke. "She's got a good stove," Silas Blackwood grumbled, "but her luck will run out. Just wait." They waited. Through the deep freeze of January, through the ice storms of February, the widow Jensen did not emerge, begging for firewood or food. The thin plume of smoke continued its steady, economical ascent into the frozen sky. The town's mockery slowly gave way to a grudging, resentful silence. They did not understand it, and therefore they distrusted it. Winter eventually broke. In early March, a strange wind blew in from the west. It was a Chinook, a snow eater. The temperature rose 40 degrees in a single day. The townspeople, weary of the cold, emerged from their cabins, blinking in the brilliant sunshine, celebrating the false spring. They saw the deep snowpack begin to melt, to run in rivulets down the frozen streets. They saw it as a blessing. Alara, watching the river from her doorway, knew it was a curse. She saw the snow on the distant black hills, a vast reservoir of frozen water, turning dark and rotten under the warm wind. She knew it was all coming their way. The river began to rise. At first, it was a subtle change, a groaning and cracking of the ice sheet. Then, the ice broke into great, churning plates, and the water, brown and angry, began to swell. It rose not by inches, but by feet. Providence Creek had been built on a wide, flat floodplain, convenient for building and close to the water. Its founders had not understood the violent mood swings of a prairie river. Within 24 hours, the lower part of town was a muddy lake. Water lapped at the foundations of the general store. By the second day, it was a disaster. The Serpent, engorged with the meltwater of an entire winter, had jumped its banks and was pouring through the town. The log cabins, Silas Blackwood's pride, stood like stones in a torrent. Their strength was useless against the insidious, rising water. It seeped through the floors, ruining food stores, extinguishing fires. Families were forced into their lofts, watching as their worldly possessions were submerged in the frigid, swirling muck. The sound of the flood was a constant, terrifying roar, punctuated by the crash of outbuildings being torn from their foundations and the panicked lowing of livestock. Providence Creek, the bastion of common sense and practicality, was being washed away. From her vantage point high on the cut bank, Ilara watched the destruction. Her home was an island of perfect safety. The floodwaters raged 20 feet below her doorway, a churning chaos of ice floes, uprooted trees, and the sad debris of her neighbors' lives. There was no triumph in her, only a deep, aching sorrow for the people who had scorned her. She had not built her home to prove them wrong. She had built it to survive. She had listened to the land, and the land had kept her safe. They had not, and they were paying the price. On the third day of the flood, a small group of figures appeared on the ridge above her home. It was Silas Blackwood and a half-dozen other townsfolk, including women and children. They were soaked, shivering, and their faces were etched with shock and despair. They had fled to the highest ground they could find, and it had led them here, to the doorstep of the folly. Silas's own home was flooded to the eaves. His workshop, with all his precious tools, was gone, swept away by the current. Everything he had built, everything he had believed in, was submerged in brown water. He stood and looked down at Ilara's home. He saw the thick, dry door. He saw the wisp of smoke from the chimney, a sign of warmth and life in a world of cold and death. He saw Ilara standing in the doorway, her son clutching her skirt, both of them warm, dry, and alive. He saw it all, and in that moment, the rigid certainty that had structured his entire life shattered into 1,000 pieces. He had built to defy the land, to impose his will upon it. She had built to listen to it, to find a partnership with it. He had seen a useless, dangerous slope. She had seen a sanctuary. Slowly, humbly, Silas Blackwood led the small group of survivors down the slippery path to her door. He stopped a few feet away, his pride a sodden weight in his chest. He, the master builder, the voice of reason, was now a refugee, begging for shelter from the madwoman in her mudhole. "Mistress Jensen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He could not meet her eyes. He looked at the hard-packed earth around her door, at the clever way she had dug a shallow ditch to channel the rain away from the entrance. He saw dozens small, brilliant details he had been blind to before. Ilara simply nodded, her expression unreadable. She stepped aside, holding the door open. "There is room," she said. One by one, they filed into the small, warm space. They looked around in stunned silence. The air was warm and dry. A pot of thin soup simmered on the stove, filling the room with a savory aroma. The clay walls seemed to glow, radiating a gentle, life-giving heat. It was not a grave. It was not a coffin. It was the safest, warmest, driest place any of them had been in days. It was a womb. Silas leaned a hand against the wall. It was solid as rock and shockingly warm to the touch. He finally understood. The earth was not the enemy. It was the answer. He turned to Ilara, his eyes finally meeting hers. All the arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate need to comprehend. "How?" he asked. It was the only word he could manage. It contained everything: his failure, her success, his confusion, her wisdom. "How did you know?" "I watched the river," Ilara said simply, ladling soup into bowls for the shivering children. "I looked at the marks from old floods. I saw where the foxes built their dens. The land tells you how to live on it. You only have to learn its language." They stayed for 2 days, a small, humbled community packed into the earth home. Ilara shared what little food she had, never once mentioning their mockery, never once saying, "I told you so." Her quiet generosity was a more profound rebuke than any words could have been. In the evenings, Silas and the other men would ask her questions. Not about the digging, but about the principles. She spoke of thermal mass, of passive ventilation, of making the smoke pay its rent. She used Eric's words, explaining the concepts as if she were talking about a ship's hull, making the strange familiar. They listened, not as experts correcting a fool, but as students before a master. When the floodwaters finally receded, they left behind a town ruined, coated in a thick layer of stinking mud. But it was not defeated. They began to rebuild. This time, however, they did not rebuild in the same place. Led by Silas Blackwood, they laid out a new town plan, on higher ground, away from the river's reach. And when they dug the foundations for their new homes, they dug them deep. They built cellars with thick, insulated walls of stone and earth. They oriented their houses to take advantage of the sun. They changed the pitch of their roofs. They began to build not against the land, but with it. The techniques, refined by Silas but originating entirely with Ilara, became known as the Jensen method. Her folly had become their foundation. Ilara never moved from her home in the bank. She lived out her days there, a quiet, respected pillar of the community she had inadvertently saved. She never presented herself as a visionary, only as a woman who had paid attention. Her son, Lars, grew up with a deep understanding of the natural world. His first classroom, a warm room carved from the earth. His first lesson, that the most profound wisdom is often silent, waiting in the soil and the sky for anyone patient enough to listen. Years later, when people would ask her for the secret to her design, she would give them the same answer. It was not a secret. It was a sermon, written in the language of geology and hydrology, of animal instinct and botanical resilience. Fire is not the gift, she would think to herself, remembering the town's obsession with their voracious stoves. Heat is the gift, and it is all around you, stored in the patient earth, offered freely by the sun. You do not need to fight the cold. You only need to learn how to hold the warmth. The land had told her exactly what to do. It had been telling everyone. She was just the only one who had stopped to listen. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters and specific events are fictional, and the content is for entertainment and illustrative purposes only. It does not constitute professional architectural, engineering, or survival advice. What about you? What forgotten knowledge lies dormant in your own history, in the stories of your grandparents, or in the quiet observations of the world around you? What seemingly useless piece of land, what overlooked principle, holds the key to your own survival? The answers are rarely found in the loud certainties of conventional wisdom. They are waiting in the quiet places, in the language of the land itself.